Well, welcome everyone. I'm so delighted that you could all make this the special webinar with our esteemed guest, Dr. Kevin Gannon. Just before we get going, I just want to be open with some acknowledgements and just some notes just to help you through this session. And I want to begin with a land acknowledgement. Kenyon College acknowledges the lands on which we live, work, celebrate, and heal are the ancestral homelands of the Miami, Lenape, Wyandot, and Shawnee peoples, among others. The disputed Treaty of Greenville in 1795 and the forced removal of Indigenous peoples from this region allowed for the founding of the college in the early 1800s. And I think as a community, we are committed, and we should be committed to confronting this dark past while also embracing through education and outreach the many Indigenous communities that continue to thrive in Ohio. And I would encourage everyone, regardless of where you're signing in from today, to confront the legacy of colonization wherever you are. I also have a few notes in terms of access. If you require a transcript, please click on the live transcript button on your Zoom panel at the bottom of the screen to access the subtitles. If you click on that link, you can show subtitles and also turn them off. This event will be recorded for later viewing via the CIP's YouTube channel. We wish to thank the Consortium on Higher Achievement and Success, CHASS, the Center for Innovative Pedagogy, and especially Joe Murphy, and co-conspirator Kiana Parks, who did a marvelous job putting forward and creating this event tonight, and also the Department of English for making this talk possible. This evening, we are delighted to introduce Dr. Kevin M. Gannon. Dr. Gannon is the director of the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning and professor of history at Grandview University. He writes for the Chronicle of Higher Education, gives frequent talks and workshops, and appeared in the Oscar-nominated documentary 13th, directed by Ava DuVernay. Over several weeks, a small group of faculty from across Kenyon College and other institutions have met, read, and discussed Dr. Gannon's book, Radical Hope, a teaching manifesto, attending to how we might implement the strategies of this book in the context of the current political moment. Indeed, many of us wondered how we might resist the relentless crises of higher education in neoliberal environments where hope has been short-circuited or displaced altogether. How do we foreground the ethics of care for our students in a society that permits white supremacy and systemic racism to flourish? We should hold the difficulty and the pain of these very questions in light of the persistence of anti-Blackness and anti-Asian hate, such as what we have witnessed in Atlanta on Tuesday night. If there's one thing that has emerged for me after reading Dr. Gannon's manifesto, it is that hope is a process that stages social change as a series of imaginative and actionable, if only incremental, refusals. If hopelessness feels relentless, and it certainly does, then hope is a condition of enabling desirable futures. For our students struggling in the long emergency of the global pandemic, feeling lost on the peripheries or excluded in the curriculum, syllabus, and classroom, then we as teachers have a responsibility to foster communities of care that can collectively imagine an expansive world for everyone. As Dr. Gannon writes in his introduction in the manifesto, teaching is a radical act of hope. It is an assertion of faith in a better future and an increasingly uncertain and fraught present. It is a commitment to that future, even if we cannot or can't clearly discern its shape. In other words, a teaching practice anchored in hope is not about abandoning the present tense, but about activating actual strategies that can transform the conditions for a socially just future. And indeed, the future can be radical, hopeful, and real. We are honored that Dr. Gannon has joined us tonight to talk about the pedagogy of hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Orchid, for that wonderful and very generous introduction. I'm honored to be here with all of you. Thank you to all out there in Zoom land for allowing me into this space with you tonight and for coming to share in this thought and this conversation about what it means to think about a pedagogy rooted in an ethic of radical hope. So let me do the awkward transition to the Zoom screen share here, which you figure I'd be getting smoother at this, given how long we've been at this hybrid sort of work here. So I'd like to direct my remarks this evening towards what we might call a pedagogy of hope. And I'm certainly not the first person to advance into this area, and I'm certainly not the most articulate proponent of thinking about pedagogies of hope. Paulo Freire and Bell Hooks are two folks who come to mind who have explored this topic as well. And as you'll see in my remarks, I lean on their work, their wisdom, and their experience quite heavily in some ways. But I do think we're at a moment now here in the spring of 2021, and we look back since almost a year ago now, which simultaneously seems both 20 years and 2 minutes ago, that everything kind of went sideways all of a sudden. It seemed as if one week we were kind of thinking, oh, hey, there's this coronavirus thing and it sounds kind of serious. And then the very next week, it's okay, everybody out of the pool. And now let's go home and live in Zoom land for the next year. And certainly in higher education, we've been reeling from this. We, our institutions, and our students as well. And so it was a weird experience having a book called Radical Hope have its official publication date is April 1st, 2020, right when all of this was happening. And I've been asked a lot since then, so what's it like to have written a book on hope and then have it come out when everything, went to hell, basically? And I don't have a great answer for that, but I can say it's been somewhat surreal. But even more than that, I think what it has really made me do is to double down in this commitment, this argument that a pedagogy of hope is even more urgent, even more vital, even more essential than it was pre-pandemic. People have asked, would you change anything you've written? I don't know if I would change it so much as I would underline and boldface it, because I believe that we are at a genuine inflection point now. And if we approach it without a vision rooted in hope, without a practice rooted in bringing about a better future from an ethic of hope, then we'll fail. We'll be lost, and we will lose to the forces that threaten to overwhelm our society and the things that we hold as good that are part of it. And while that may seem overwrought, these are overwrought times, right? As the saying goes, truth is stranger than fiction. But it might seem odd to be talking about a pedagogy of hope in the background of a pandemic that has been global in nature and has killed over 500,000 people in the United States that we know of. We also know that it is a pandemic that has laid bare the scars and the fault lines of racism and of white supremacism in our society. The coronavirus has affected communities of color disproportionately in terms of its effects on the community as a whole, and even direct medical effects like death rate, illness rate, etc. Even more recently, as Orchid mentioned, just 2 nights ago, we were coming to terms with an explosion of anti-Asian and white supremacist violence across the Atlanta metro area, and watching law enforcement in that area attempt to excuse what had happened as someone having, quote, a really bad day. And all of this is unfolding, of course, against one of the most visible surges of white nationalism, of white supremacist violence that we've seen in the United States, and certainly in our recent times. Now, this is not a new thing, unfortunately and tragically, but the incarnations that we are seeing now and the access, both literal and figurative, that white supremacism has to the halls of power in the United States is, I think, unprecedented in many ways. But even the January 6th insurrection was just, if you will, the pot boiling over a little bit. In our COVID summer last year, After the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, for example, when the nation confronted, some of us for the first time, some of us in a long, dreary pattern of realization, the violence and the racism inherent within this country's system of policing and incarceration. And even before that, the places that white supremacism has taken and center stage, a vision of exclusion, of marginalization, of hatred, rather than welcome. It is anti-hope. The people carrying tiki torches in Charlottesville in 2017, like this gentleman here, who is, by the way, I'm not sure if he graduated yet, but a history major at a university, the University of Nevada. And this picture, as I mentioned in the book, got me thinking a lot about is, should someone be able to go through a college education and get a history degree, for example, and having acquired that knowledge and, having achieved the learning outcomes of that academic program, can they go and do this? Carry torches through Charlottesville and a violent display of white supremacism, chanting, among other things, Jews will not replace us. And if someone can do that, should they be able to? What are the ends that we seek in higher education? And in higher education, how are we a part of this larger social crisis, this inflection point that we find ourselves at? Because even though the word crisis may be overused sometimes, when we talk about things like a consumer crisis, a crisis of confidence, a housing crisis, a crisis of this, a crisis of that, I think it's reasonable to say that we are at a crisis point, both nationally and globally. It is clear that the status quo has become increasingly unsustainable for more and more people. But it is also equally clear, if not more, that the defenders of that status quo, or those who want to entrench it even further, will resort to violent ends with which to accomplish those goals. As the communist thinker Antonio Gramsci, the Italian communist thinker of the 1920s and 30s, wrote in prison, where he had been incarcerated due to his opposition to Benito Mussolini's emerging fascist regime in Italy, Gramsci analyzed the period that he found himself in, and is, with a front row seat to one of the first organized fascist movements in modern history. Gramsci wrote that the crisis he found himself in, and his fellow Italians found themselves in, consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. And in this interregnum, this sort of limbo, if you will, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. Morbid symptoms, symptoms of impending death, a society necrotizing before our eyes. Gramsci's work has been translated by many authors. One of the more colorful ones is from the philosopher Slavoj Zizek, who translates this phrase as the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. So against all this, what sense does it make to talk about a pedagogical praxis that is the blend of theory and practice? What sense does it make to talk about a praxis rooted in hope? What the hell would that look like in the time of monsters? So I think we should be very clear about what it is that we're not doing before we talk about what it is that we are doing. A pedagogy of hope rests on a concept of hope that is important to define, I think. Hope is one of those words that we use often in our society. And because of that use, the extensive nature of it, I think it gets stretched sometimes, stretched to a point where it loses its utility, it loses its meaning, it loses its power. It's very easy, for example, to say, well, I have hope. I'm an optimist, right? I have hope in the future. I have hope in the children. The children will create the better future, right? What's the line from the song? I believe the children are our future. It's really easy to say stuff like that and have that be the off-ramp, right? One could say, I have hope in the future, as if, the future will be good just because time will have passed between then and now. But that depends upon things getting better as a result of time passing, which as a historian, I can tell you is not true, right? But don't we often say, point to some sort of vague definition of hope as a way to almost abdicate our role? or our responsibility even in bringing that better future around and making it tangible. If I say I have hope in the future, what I might also be implicitly saying is, and other people will work on bringing that future about. Call me if you need anything. So I think it's really important that we're careful not to take a definition of hope that absolves us from the responsibility of creating the conditions where that hope can become operationalized. Having hope also does not mean we have the answer to every problem that is in front of us. There is only one person who has the answer to every problem in our society, and that is Phil Swift, the inventor of the Flex Seal line of products, which will fix anything. If you see the TV commercials, you know what I'm talking about. An ethic grounded in hope does not pretend to have all the answers. An ethic grounded in hope is a process of becoming, not of quickly solving everybody else's problems for them. But it's also not mindless cheerleading either. It's okay to say that everything is not awesome and to have hope that one day it might be. We don't know where it is we need to go, much less how it is we might want to get there, if we are not unflinchingly honest about where we currently stand. And so while it may seem somewhat unusual to open a talk about a pedagogy of hope with images of violence, of racism, of white supremacism run amok, and quotes about the time of monsters, we have to be honest about where we are. If the old saying is true, that hope without action is fantasy, and I believe it is, then hope without the action of critical reflection and discernment is equally fantastic in the literal sense of the term. So, can you hold hope and rage in the same hand? I believe you can. And in fact, Paulo Freire, who wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed, probably one of the most influential books on what we call critical pedagogy today, also wrote a book that revisited that original masterwork some 20 or 30 years later, a book called The Pedagogy of Hope. And he referred to the book that he was writing in its introduction as a book written in rage and love, without which, he says, there is no hope. And I found that the first time I encountered this sentence, something I really wanted to sit with for a while. That hope is a product, and as Freire argues, cannot exist without rage and love. And so all rage consumes us. We become, as those marchers in the hallways of the US Capitol on January 6th were, consumed by rage, focused on no longer term outcome than venting that rage upon the nearest target of convenience. Rage and love, without which there is no hope. And so a good, righteous rage is necessary sometimes. Sometimes we need to storm the Bastille. Sometimes we need to storm the barricades. Sometimes we need to stand astride of what is happening in our current moment and say no more. Sometimes being nice ceases to be effective. But just because one is acting in rage does not mean that one cannot show love either. Now, in our present day, many moderates and even conservatives love to take the image of Martin Luther King Jr. and say King was nonviolent, and so everybody should just be quiet and be very nice in the spirit of Martin Luther King Jr. But of course, that's not what Martin Luther King Jr.'s vision of nonviolence was about. It was about direct action. It was about confrontation. It was about a refusal to abide systemic injustices that were ingrained in our society, but it was done out of a sense of love and hope for what that society could be instead of what it was. So rage and love are the foundation that we might seek to adopt a pedagogy of hope. I love the way that Rebecca Solnit in her essay, Hope in the Dark, frames this concept of hope, because again, it gets at this action-oriented, non-fuzzy, non-platitude nature of what hope really looks like in operation. Solnit writes that hope is not a lottery ticket that you sit on the sofa and clutch just feeling lucky. It is an axe, she says, with which you break down doors in an emergency. To hope is to give yourself to the future, and that commitment to the future is what makes the present inhabitable. And I'd like to highlight that and sit with this for a second. right? Hope is not just something that we look at as a better future outcome. Hope is also something that animates us in the intolerable present. There's a lot about the present that sucks, to use a technical historian's term. But how do we inhabit that present? And how do we inhabit that present without surrendering the hope and the motivation that we have to bring about what we know could be a better future? And so, to use Solnit's terms, we grab the axe and we break down the door and we get to the work. Peter Felton and some of his colleagues wrote or conducted some research about educational outcomes among certain populations of students in higher education, and looked at this concept of hope in terms of students believing that tangible good outcomes would be possible in situations that these students initially thought that they could not succeed in. And one of the interesting formulations of this research that Felton and his colleagues were able to frame, I think, is another useful way of sitting with this concept of hope. Hope, they argue, if a student were to have hope in achieving a positive outcome, so say a student comes into a math class and that student has never been successful at math before. And we know from the research, right, that students tend to have significant anxiety towards certain disciplines, and math is number one on that list. And there's a variety of reasons for that. But if a student comes in with anxiety towards the class, a track record that has not been a successful one in previous attempts at that particular discipline, what does that student need to have genuine hope in a positive outcome this time, right? That this time will be different, that this time I could succeed even if I have not been able to before. And what Felton and his colleagues argued is that this kind of hope, this tangible, motivating hope, is the product of two distinct and as equally essential components. The first was a sense of agency. So if we want a hopeful outcome, if we believe in a better future state, we also have to believe that we have agency, that we have the power to engage the work and engage the process that will bring that positive outcome about. But it's not enough just to believe you can do something. You also need to see how you can do something. And so the second element here is again equally essential, and that's pathway or pathways, right? And so to believe that this positive outcome in the future, that to have hope in a distant point at the end of a particular journey, I have to have this sense of agency, but I also have to see clear pathways that I might take to bring about that outcome. And once we have that combination of meaningful agency and pathway or pathways, then hope becomes tangible, becomes actionable, becomes plausible. And it makes, as Solnit says, our present inhabitable. And the agency piece, I think, is so crucial here. How many of our students have come to us being told stories that, learning is what you get put into your head, right? What Freire called the banking model of education. You sit there, I deliver content, you absorb that content, you spit that content back out to me on a test, and I'll say you've learned something, and then we go on our happy ways, right? How many students have been told the story that they don't have agency in their own education? And without feeling a sense of agency in their own education, how can our students feel a sense of agency in doing what education is supposed to prepare them to do, to intervene in their own reality, to bring about a better world than the one that exists now? And again, Freire gives us a way to, I think, conceive of this very powerfully. Social reality is not the product of accidents. It's the product of action. And so where we are today in our crisis-filled moment, those crises did not emerge by accident. They are the products of decisions made or decisions abdicated. They are the product of agency and choice by some to deprive others of those same things. And so just because where we are does not exist by chance, so too is it the case that the solutions to those problems, the ways that we transform our society, are not left to chance either. If social beings, if humankind, as Freire says, produces social reality, then transforming that reality is also a task for humankind. So it's a historical task. In other words, it's something that can be done in the here and now, that it's not left up to some abstract process by which no one has any agency. And Stephen Jay Gould, the evolutionary biologist, gets at the same thing in his own meditations, where he sort of reflects on things that it might be easy to say, well, it's human nature for people to be violent, to be sexist, to be misogynist, to be racist, to be, as he puts it, generally nasty, right? And sure, those are biological things. It's a subset, Gould says, of a possible range of behaviors, but those aren't the only choices. And so the reason I like this reflection from Gould is because it challenges us to realize that where we are now, as unsustainable as it seems, as, dare I say, hopeless as it seems, where we are now is the product of choices that were made, of imaginations. And so how do we imagine differently? How do we imagine a society where force and violence is not our response to a public health crisis, for example? How do we dream differently? How do we, in other words, elevate things like peacefulness, equality, and kindness to their rightful places, equally, if not more powerful biological traits? And as Gould says, if we create the social structures where those things flourish, as opposed to what currently flourishes in our time of monsters, what would that look like? In higher education, we are uniquely positioned to help students and to help ourselves in this larger community of teaching and learning imagine differently. Because the key obstacle to thinking differently, to imagining a different future, to imagining a different set of choices, to imagining a different outcome, the greatest obstacle in the way of that is not even knowing that that imagination is possible, a failure of imagination. We're all familiar with Frederick Douglass. I could make a joke about, he's doing more and more, in fact, I just made the joke, sorry. And I'm also breaking the rule of putting too much text on a slide, but I want to sort of dive into this sentiment here as well from Douglass, who is one of my absolute heroes when it comes to rhetoric and when it comes to framing things in words that capture so much more than what they might immediately seem to refer to. And this is a quote that y'all have probably heard a lot, right? Or at least the first sentence: if there is no struggle, there is no progress, right? And so what Douglass is doing is answering critics here who are saying, whoa, 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 sure, we're fine with abolition of slavery, but y'all are rocking the boat too much. You're gonna antagonize potential allies. Take it easy, right? And where do we hear the echoes of this today, right? I wish the Black Lives Matter people wouldn't shut down highways in their protests. They're going to alienate people, right? Take it easy. Douglass's rejoinder to that argument, both in his own day and then, by extension ours, is if there is no struggle, there is no progress. You want the result without doing the work. But what I like about this quote from Douglass is the end. It must be a struggle because power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. And that is what we are up against. For those of us seeking to enact a hopeful vision of a better future in the face of an unsustainable, unjust present, we are demanding that power make concessions. And that is against what power does. Structures of inequality, such as the ones that so thoroughly define the society in which we and our students live, the default process for these structures is to reproduce themselves. So we go from the black enslavement before the Civil War to convict leasing to Jim Crow and lynching to the war on drugs and mass incarceration today. Systems of inequality reproduce themselves as a historical phenomenon. This is the default mode, unless we intervene to stop that process of reproduction. And so the key question then is, how do we intervene? How do we stop the process whereby unjust and unequal systems of violence, of power imbalance, of silencing, how do we intervene? In higher education, then, this is the question that can guide our practice. How do we intervene? Because in higher education, what we have learned, which was evident pre-COVID, but laid bare to the point of being unavoidable post-COVID and to our day today, What have we learned about the larger structures of inequality that have shaped the ways in which teaching and learning can occur, that have shaped the experience of our students, of our colleagues, of our communities? What can we no longer ignore? And then what are we going to do with that knowledge? So if we've learned things, how do we put those things into action? Because lessons were indeed learned from our shift to what we might call emergency remote instruction in last March, through today. We learned lots of things. We learned things that we can no longer hide from. So, for example, we knew before COVID in higher education that the digital divide was a thing. Like, we knew that intellectually. And we knew that, well, yes, there are some of our students, we would say, that have difficulty accessing high-speed internet at home or don't have the devices to do online or digital learning effectively. But we've got computer labs and library facilities, so these students still have access to the things that they need. Well, they did until campuses closed and public libraries closed. And then I had students in their cars in the McDonald's parking lot on their smartphones working on the McDonald's Wi-Fi to submit a paper. And so we learned that the problems that we could sort of intellectualize and sweep under the rug were no longer sweepable. So that's one example then of the lessons that we've learned. One example of the knowledge that we can no longer avoid. We can't rationalize away the inequality, the problems and barriers to learning that have so adversely impacted so many of our students since that COVID shift last March. One of the other things that we learned right away with the phenomenon of COVID was fear is a really easy place to make decisions from, seductively easy, as a matter of fact. Are we making decisions from a place of fear? And one of the things that I think disturbed me so much as we were shifting as a campus and as a larger sector of higher education to emergency remote instruction was the emphasis on the dominant element of the conversation not being how do we make teaching and learning work better online, but what's going to happen when, not if, my students cheat, right? And so it was almost as if we said, immediately when things started going online, this was the big concern. And so there were a lot of companies, Proctorio only is the most notorious example, that made a lot of money profiting off of this fear and this need to police students. We all felt such a profound loss of control over the learning environment that for many of us, the chance to control something, in this case, the way that students took high stakes assessments that were never designed for online classes to begin with, that sense of control proved quite appealing. But of course, it did a lot of damage and continues to do a lot of damage as well. When we make decisions based in fear as opposed to hope, we become hoarders. We clutch at the things that we see as scarce because it gives us the illusion of being in control of something. And in reality, what that control wasn't a control over better learning, wasn't a control over a good teaching and learning experience or a community of learning with our students. It was control over tools of discipline and surveillance, which are antithetical to the very heart of the enterprise that we are after. Are we going to continue making decisions based in fear? In an era of tightening budgets, of continuing jobs crises across higher education, but especially in the humanities, the continuing adjunctification of the faculty, the continuing and spiraling out of control crisis of college debt for so many of our students. Will that scarcity mentality condition us to make decisions out of fear? Or can we find an antidote to that? I would suggest that thinking in terms of community, where are our allies? We know who the adversaries are. Where are our allies? Where are our people? How do we come together in a sense of genuine care, an ethic of care, as Nell Noddings wrote about? How do we do that? Hope can be found in communities. Community in higher education, as Bell Hooks wrote in her book, Teaching Community, is a place, she says, that is life-sustaining and mind-expanding. It's a place of liberating mutuality, where we work together with students in partnership. That is a much more attractive vision of what higher education could be than surveillance technology and discourse about cheating and punishment. So how do we create community? How do we create a community that is, to use Hooks's words, life sustaining and mind expanding? Because when we talk about higher education, when we're telling students they should come to our college, for example, we're telling them things like this. We're saying this is a place that will do these things, right? That's a promise that we're making to students. How do we actually put that promise into operation? Because for many of our students, that's not what they're finding. Many of our students are coming into our college communities and they are experiencing them not as spaces of welcome, but spaces of marginalization. Spaces where they had been at one point invited into the center, but very quickly in reality pushed to the margins. How many of our students arrive on our campuses, whether they're physical or virtual campuses, with only rudimentary maps with which to navigate the circumstances that they find themselves in? How many of our students are learning things from us that we don't even realize that we're teaching? So many of you have probably heard the phrase the hidden curriculum. And I think that this is a really powerful way to think about what's happening in these both virtual and physical communities that define higher education. So we have our formal curriculum, right? You know, here's the syllabus, here are the learning outcomes, here are the things you got to read, here's where your grade comes from, here are the prerequisites for this course, here's the requirements to do a degree in X, right? We've got plenty of formal curriculum, and that's out front and that's explicit. But over, beneath, around, and suffusing entirely through those formal curricula is the hidden curriculum. As Leeks puts it, the hidden curriculum are these incidental lessons. That doesn't mean that they're trivial, that just means they're incidental, right? That are learned about power and authority, about what and whose knowledge is valued and what whose knowledge is not valued, whose voice counts and whose doesn't. Our campuses, again, physically or virtually speaking, our entire campuses are teaching and learning spaces. All of us who work in higher education are teachers because our students are always learning. They are learning not just in the physical or the online classroom. They're not learning in just the face-to-face seminar or the talk or the lecture, but they are learning in the dining hall. They are learning in the parking lot. They are learning in the registrar's office, the bursar's office, the dorms. They are learning everywhere. What are we teaching them? What are they learning? So for example, much of the research we have about class discussion and active learning suggests that in a class discussion environment, that most faculty, white male faculty are the worst at this, but faculty from all demographic groups do this to a degree, call on male students statistically significantly more than female students, even in classes where female students outnumber male students. We also know from some of this same research that male students get away with interrupting female students much more often than the reverse. That is, are able to interrupt and talk over without any consequences or without being asked to stop. And so imagine a female student in one of these classes where I'm the instructor and I fall into those patterns where I always call on the male students first, or the male students just jump in, or when a female student is talking and gets interrupted by a male student and I divert right to that male student. What is that female student learning about whose voice is heard and whose isn't, about whose knowledge is important and whose isn't, about who matters and who doesn't? That's the hidden curriculum. And it is in operation, and students are learning. So, what are we teaching them? Many students arrive to us already having been taught, having been told, and then having fashioned their own self narrative that maybe they don't belong here. Right. So think of the student who senior year of high school goes to the guidance counselor and says, you know, I need to think about applying to college. And the guidance counselor says, well, have you thought about HVAC repair or welding? You know, certificates in those lead to very good paying jobs. So students are often told you don't belong here. Students will tell themselves, I can't do math. I can't do X, right? You know, we know about the research on growth and fixed mindsets, for example. Many students come to us with, as Walton and Cohen called it, belonging uncertainty. And what that basically means is that they arrive on campus with the hypothesis already in place. People like me do not belong here. And as the psychologists tell us, confirmation bias is a thing, right? We are attuned to notice the evidence that supports our pre-existing hypotheses more than other inputs. And so what we have is a problem because students will come to us with this sense of belonging uncertainty, with a hypothesis that says, I don't belong here. But the problem is they usually find the evidence to confirm that hypothesis. So what do we do? What do we do with this knowledge that we can no longer avoid, that we are ethically ethically required to confront? Our theory, whether we admit we have one or not, is what gives shape to our practice. The way we think about what learning is and isn't, about what students should have or shouldn't have, about what college ready is, about what good writing is, right? We have these assumptions. They are within us, whether we realize it or not. And it is that set of theories that is giving shape to practice, just like theory being a set of lenses through which I am now looking at the work that I'm doing. So what are our theoretical and pedagogical lenses? Are they smudged? Do we even know we're wearing glasses? So let me suggest a few ways that we might clarify where we are in terms of our thinking about the work that we are doing with and among students every day. Do we design courses for students, or do we design courses in spite of them? So think about our first year courses, for example, when we talk about a student should have X before they come to college. And so we'll assume that they've done X things. Well, we've got a lot of students right now in their high school years that have been extremely disrupted by COVID and by online learning done in a range of different ways. And what is happening is that we are rewarding students for cultural capital and for attending well-resourced schools more than anything else. There are going to be students coming to us who have experienced significant gaps in the curriculum that we are assuming that they have completed. Some people call this learning loss. I reject that term. They're not losing learning. They're learning plenty, but they're not covering things in the ways that some might define as college ready. Are we making design choices with this in mind? Are we designing courses that invite students to the center, that tell them they could be part of this scholarly conversation, that they too could be knowledge creators in this field? Or are we designing courses to put up barriers, to gatekeep, to check admission criteria before they're allowed to learn? What if we created teaching and learning spaces for human beings? Now, this may sound like kind of a laughable truism, right? Well, who else are we creating teaching and learning spaces for? I would argue that a lot of times when we approach designing teaching and learning spaces, we basically do it for heads on sticks or brains on sticks. That we talk about cognitive outcomes and learning outcomes a lot, but we don't think about the rest of the student beside the brain. What if we created teaching and learning spaces that acknowledge students as the full and complicated human beings that they are? In the same way that we too are full and complicated human beings. Our students do not come to us from a vacuum. And so even if we teach in a discipline that we might not think is political, I teach math, numbers are numbers, equations are equations, and I'm not just picking on the math people here. Your students don't come to you from a vacuum. Your students come to you from a world that has been dramatically shaped by structures of inequality, by injustice, and by increasing violence. Are we designing teaching and learning spaces for the human beings that are coming out of that world into our classroom? Are we creating learning spaces that foster genuine and meaningful connections? Do we learn in community? Or is learning simply a series of separate conversations, of monologues even, between instructor and one student repeated 25 or 30 times across the class? And this is a particularly important question as a lot more of our teaching and learning is being done fully online or at least digitally mediated. It is very easy to fall into that rut where all I'm doing is talking with one student at one time about one thing. And everybody is atomized and distant, and there's no sense of connection or community. But what we know from the teaching and learning research about online learning and learning in general is that the more the sense of community, of social presence that we all have in a particular learning space, the better the outcomes are for everyone. So how do we create learning spaces that foster meaningful and genuine connections? We stop obsessing over content. And I may lose my professional historian card for this because in my discipline, we talk about covering content all the time. But if you think about it, covering content is something we do, not students. And so if I'm teaching a class and I say, yeah, we covered the French Revolution today in class, there wasn't no we about it. I covered the French Revolution. And the assumption behind that statement is that because I talked about the French Revolution in the same room or the same Zoom room as 30 students, that they learned about the French Revolution simply by being present, right? It's learning by osmosis, and we know that it doesn't work that way. And so let's get out of this paradigm where we talk about I am covering content. That's what I do. So what are the students doing during this whole time? Are they learning, or am I simply performing? Learning is both a cognitive and an affective process. We have research from folks like Sarah Rose Kavanaugh in her book, The Spark of Learning, about the role that emotions and emotional regulation play in learning. We know that, again, we're not teaching brains on sticks, we're teaching human beings. And anxiety and stress and depletion of cognitive bandwidth will often mean that students aren't able to bring their full selves to bear on the tasks that we're asking them to do. How are we creating teaching and learning spaces that allow for that reality to exist and to support students as they navigate through it? And over and above all of this, we depend upon the assumption here that students are our allies in all of this. They want what we want. They're not our adversaries. And in times where we feel like we've lost control, in times of enormous anxiety and stress, sometimes we take that out on students because they're the nearest and most convenient target. But that is not the answer. That is a one-way ticket to being so cynical that there's no hope of redemption of our practice whatsoever. Students are our allies in this, not our adversaries. So we have to ask them, what are we saying to our students when, for example, we rush to surveillance technology to proctor exams and high stakes assessments when we have gone to emergency remote learning? Are we telling our students that we trust them as adults? Or are we telling our students, hey, now that we're online, my assumption about you is that you are going to cheat no matter what? That is what I think your motivations are, right? And so we use all of these tools, but we also know from the research that those are tools that function with a significant equity tax associated with them. Test anxiety is a thing already. And common features of these test monitoring services, as Woldham and Brothen found in 2019, that some students are even more disadvantaged than others. So this is an equity issue as well. So surveillance software that has students shine a light in their faces if they're darker complected, so that they're not seen as cheating or non-compliant during the administration of an online exam. Is that what we're really about? Is that seeing our students as allies, or is that positioning them as adversaries? What if we took the advice of Jesse Stommel, who several years ago started a great Twitter hashtag? It's really worth searching this hashtag and looking at the replies on it. What's your 4-word pedagogy? I don't think you're going to get much better than start by trusting students. Because as Sean Michael Morris puts it in elaborating on this concept, when we talk about remote proctoring, for example, we forget this basic truth. Students aren't coming to college to cheat. They're coming to college to learn. Now, that may look a little different in their eyes than what it looks like in our eyes, but we are allies. We are not adversaries in this. So my first semester of undergraduate, I failed intermediate Latin, like spectacularly failed it. But I do remember the infinitive forms of some of the words in Latin, including educare, which is the Latin word that means to draw out, to draw forth. And that's the root word of our modern English word, education. We are in the drawing out, the drawing forth business. We are getting students to draw out things they didn't even know they had, potential that is dormant or untapped. We're drawing out a sense of courage, the ability to take risks and to learn from adversity and failure, but to learn from successes and celebrate those successes as well. We are drawing out from our students. But you can't draw something out if it's locked behind a fence. Education cannot occur when barriers like this come between us and our students. So a pedagogy of hope then. What does our practice look like if it's informed by this ethic? A pedagogy of hope, I would submit, requires us, demands of us that we own our stance, that we acknowledge, affirm, and stand conspicuously on our theory and our practice. Here I stand, here is what I believe, here is why I think that helps students in teaching and learning, and this is where my practice and my ethics come from. And we do so and create learning spaces for actual human beings, not just brains on sticks. And in those spaces, our students and everybody in those spaces, ourselves included, feel like they genuinely belong, that they could be fully present as themselves. When we do that, we are also remembering that learning is affective, not just cognitive. And then in all of this, students are allies, our natural allies, not our adversaries. In order to bring all of this about, in order to abide by these tenets, we are acting from hope and not fear. And those two things take us to two diametrically different places. As Paulo Freire writes, when it becomes a program hopelessness, which is accelerated by fearfulness, it paralyzes us, he said, it immobilizes us. We succumb to fatalism. How many of those cynical, burned out colleagues have we seen that think that what they do doesn't even matter and that just hate students at this point, right? If we succumb to fatalism, it becomes impossible to muster the strength that we absolutely need, Freire says, for the fierce struggle that will recreate the world. Now, that may sound overwrought, but think about it for a second. Is that not what we are involved in the world of higher education? Are we not involved and engaged in every day a fierce struggle to recreate the world? Fierce doesn't have to mean violent. Fierce could mean committed, passionate, loving, and still relentless. I am hopeful, Freire says, not out of mere stubbornness, but out of an existential imperative. Acting from hope is, for Freire, and I would submit for us, the only alternative. And so my challenge to you, commit radical acts of hope. Have hope be the radical, root, fundamental nature of your practice in the fierce struggle that we are all engaged in to recreate the world. So thank you so much for letting me share the space with you tonight. I hope that some of this resonated and sparked some thought and will make its way into your thinking about your practice on what we're doing with our students on a day-to-day basis. So thank you again. It's a real honor to be here with you, and I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. No, thank you so much, Kevin. Dr. Gannon, I have mentioned this to you already before, but it's really been a pleasure kind of engaging with your text and hearing you speak further about it with us today. And I have so many questions that I would like to pose, but before I kind of hop in and ask my first question, I do want to kind of signal to the audience that you all should take the time to add your questions to using the Q&A tool, which should be on the lower right-hand side of your screen. I believe we do already have one question in the queue. But yes, thank you all of these attendees for adding their thanks to the chat as well. Hopefully you can see that, Dr. Gannon. But my first question, I was like you, struck by Douglas's quote about power concedes nothing without a demand. And I'm thinking now about what is it that we can demand from our institutions in this space of kind of pandemic conditions? One of the things that, or phrases that have kind of come into use surrounding our present moment is new normal, right? But you and I, and hopefully my colleagues and attendants, know that this new normal is supplanted, right, by what has already always been and been oppressive. And so I want to err on the side of hope and ask, what is something that we can take from these conditions and push to keep as a pathway to hope, right? Like, what is something perhaps that you've seen that we need to implement, we need to demand from the powers that be, that it carries on into whatever future imaginings we have for these academic spaces?
That's the fundamental question, right? And I've got two thoughts on that. I think we could talk on this all night. But I think two things that immediately come to mind. The first is when everything went to hell in last March, and we were all moving into this online space, and one of even though there was a lot of focus on like control and how do we stop cheating, there was also this really strong current of we all need to give each other flexibility, compassion. We need to understand that everybody's lives are being disrupted, that, this is a completely unprecedented circumstance. And so we did things like, okay, I'm going to drop my deadlines and be more flexible. I'm going to redo my assignments. If students are there, that's great, right? Like I'm not, and you know what? We did all of these things that some of us have been told that if you do those things, Western civilization will collapse and rigor will go away and higher education will be a joke. But we did all those things and the world continued to rotate and we were all better for it as a result. I would like for us to remain in that space where we did openly acknowledge and affirm the need for compassion and flexibility and human-centered education, especially and more so because we were going to be in these digital environments. That was a really just excellent space for folks to be in, and it sucked that we had to have a pandemic put us there, but we can't get out of that space now. So that's my first thought. My second thought is there's been a lot of talk about, when we get back to normal. And, I think we all know that, that horse has left the barn, right? So it's going to be a new normal. But I do worry that it's really seductive to want to go back to the way things were when they were uncomplicated. But, things were complicated and unsustainable for so many of our students and our fellow community members. And so if someone who's in a privileged position like me, for example, a tenured white dude, full professor says, I just want to go back to normal where I can teach my classes in person and everything was great, I'm really missing the point. Because again, we have learned so many things about how normal was unsustainable and remains unsustainable for so many folks. And if we have learned that and then refuse to act on that knowledge, then we are failing. We're failing ourselves, we're failing our institutions. And certainly we're failing the students that we profess to serve.
Thank you. So we do have 2 questions now in the chat, and I also have several more. So if no one adds questions, don't worry, we won't go without. But the first question is pretty specific, and it comes from Andrea White, and she is asking about which surveillance software asks darker complexion students to shine a light on their face. And I'm not sure if you know the specific software, but if you do, I'm sure there are others who would kind of like to query that.
Yeah, so I don't want to say the specific name because I may be misremembering it, but so a lot of this proctoring software uses facial recognition technology. It has algorithms that are written to detect suspicious behavior. But the facial recognition technology doesn't work in some cases, depending on the ambient lighting for people who have darker complexions. And so we have students who talk about, I am a Black student, I am from Africa, and I am being told that I have to have a light on my face the whole time I'm taking the exam, so the software will recognize me as actually present at the computer. And so and this is what happens, right? We see that when design is when technology is designed by mostly white people, it becomes weaponized. That design becomes weaponized against people of color. Like the old, the first generation of those, wave your hand under the hairdryer in the bathroom, like that didn't used to recognize Black people's skin. And some of the older models still don't. So the assumption is like, well, I guess you're not drying your hands after you wash them, right? Like weaponized design. And so, yeah, some of these proctoring solutions, because they require that facial recognition, imagine taking an exam online in a class that you're probably already stressed about, and maybe you're not on a great internet connection, so you're worried about it dropping anyway. And then now the program is telling you that you're going to be flagged for suspicious behavior if you don't shine a light in your face. I mean, I don't know what we're assessing there, but it ain't learning. So yeah, and so I think that that's a fairly common feature for several of the proctoring services that are out there.
And I think this next question is about assignment. And I think in some ways you've already begun to address it in your answer to my very first question. But an anonymous attendee asked about how we foster a space of hope when we're measuring everything with pure numbers rather than quality, right? That students are extremely competitive. There's so much pressure. And right now I'm kind of teaching a class on millennial angst, and my students are expressing to me the ways in which they feel pressure to perform, pressure to be perfect, pressure to get that job right out of undergrad. And so how do we, make space for students to be released from that pressure, right? Even as the institution itself tells them, here is your grade, here is your transcript, when they exit for 4 years.
And that's what they've been told since they were old enough to know about what schooling and academics was, right? Get good grades so you could go to a good college and get a good job that pays a lot, right? And so it's very frustrating as an instructor when I see students who are obsessing over grades. But it's frustrating. I can't be frustrated at the students because that's what they've been told is the way to success, right? That's the narrative. And whether or not they fully buy into it, they know that those are at least the rules of the game that they feel like they have to be playing. So I could be mad on their behalf, but I can't be mad at them. As frustrating as that conversation gets. The best answer to that is ungrading, which is a practice where you basically eliminate. You have grades, but it's through a collaborative process that students select a grade at the end of the course. The whole course itself is built on a much more genuine sense of feedback, of conversation, of formative assessment rather than that high stakes summative stuff. But also there is a rigor and a comprehensiveness to ungrading done well that is simply not present in regular traditional graded classes. Ungrading is, I've been on a journey towards it for a long time, and it's probably been too slow, but I'm diving in. I've been gradually working my way there over the years, and I'm going full ungrading next academic year. I cannot make the case to myself that traditional grading accomplishes the things that we say we're trying to accomplish in higher education. I'm not doing justice to it in the way that a lot more experienced folks in this community do. I will say there's a new book called Ungrading, coincidentally enough. It's a collection of essays from a number of practitioners. It's edited by Susan Deborah Bloom. And it's in the West Virginia Higher Ed Teaching and Learning in Higher Ed series. And it's in paperback. And from the introduction through every chapter in there, it's nuts and bolts, theory to practice. It's an enormously helpful resource, probably the best resource I've come across in ungrading. And so if this is somewhere where you feel yourself moving in your journey, that's the place to start.
Yeah. And it strikes me that one of the last quotes that you shared with us was that, right, learning is both cognitive and an affective process. That, right, we tend to often want to move into the cognitive in ways that leave out that affective. And I think that speaks to our move towards ungrading, right? That students are learning and have multiple ways of digesting and approaching knowledge. So the next question comes from Shannon Simpson, and there's a word in there that scares me, math, because I was one of those students who said, no, I can't do math. And I still happen to be one of those. But she asks, she writes, discussions of real authority and confirmation bias have a lot of overlap with information literacy. As a librarian, I integrate these into as many classes as I can. And usually in the context of writing research papers and the voices or sources that we rely on for evidence. And what she's curious about is, how might you incorporate this into 100 to 400 level math courses? She says, thank you for such an awesome presentation as well. And so have you thought about how to take this to the next level for anti-racist integration in math? And I think that's a great question. In part, math and sciences, we're always fielding those kinds of questions from colleagues in that field, is how do you integrate this kind of thought and work into that particular space?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think one of the essential things as we think about working with students in those fields, and I'll use math as the example because I think it's the most salient one here. It's just numbers, right? Where does all this other stuff come in? I think it's worth having that metacognitive conversation with students. Like, how do we treat math, right? So it's like the old, like the quote that was attributed to Mark Twain, right? 3 types of untruths: lies, damn lies, and statistics. Like, we use numbers to say things in a certain way, like with the cloak of authority and legitimacy. And the same is true for scientific discourse, right? And so we could say, oh, these things aren't political, but they are, right? There's a really good book called Weapons of Math Destruction that talks about, the ways in which, this sort of math discourse does, what the question gets at. It assumes, or we assume, because it's a certain type of discourse that is authoritative and true. And so we don't subject it to the same sort of lenses that we might a text-based website, for example. So I think that's where we start with students, is talk about, how do we approach math? Because so many of us are intimidated by numbers that we sort of, we say, oh, it must be true because I don't want to go check their work, right? Because I don't know where to start. But that's not what it's about. So we need to, it's a mode of almost discourse analysis there. But information literacy, I think one of the key aspects of that is paying attention to how do we treat these different genres of information, and what assumptions do we make about them, and what assumptions do those genres make about us, right? And math is, I think, the most promising way, because that's a big complex knot there that we need to untie. And information literacy work focused on that, I think, is a really great way to start that process with students.
Thank you. So we have
yes, multiplications for, I knew I was forgetting another. That book is awesome. Highly, Lisa Delpin is great.
Math on Trial. And indeed it is, always, for me at least. But, oh, that's a text that you're talking about. But for me, math is on trial. I think this is a great question that's kind of going to turn us to thinking about faculty and how they operate, I guess, within a space of hope. So an anonymous attendee writes, how can we start to support each other as colleagues with this sense of hope and build it into tenure promotion structure in some way? I feel it is significantly easier to have a pedagogy of hope with my students, but the institutional barriers are real. As an overworked contingent faculty member, the experience is rough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So a lot of thoughts on that. And I was a freeway flyer for a couple of years at different places, 80 miles apart on the same day of classes. So I get that, right, in a visceral way. I think some of the questions that we need to be asking ourselves at the institution: how are our part-time and adjunct colleagues a part of our departmental culture? And the answer to that is often they aren't, but they need to be, right? Like, do we involve our part-time colleagues in department business and department meetings? We don't want to ask for uncompensated labor, but we do want to build community. And, all too often what happens is we have these sort of segregated faculty groups, even in departments that profess to be all about this more critical orientation towards pedagogy. So if you think about it, we're really not modeling our principles in action very well there. So we need to do a really hard look at the ways in which we're building faculty community. Because if we're trying to build student, communities with students, and we're not modeling that in our own professional identities, then we're really failing in that respect. So that's one thought. The second thought is as institutions, we need to be very mindful of how we support faculty who are doing this work. Whether it's work that's focused on diversity and equity, for example, are we asking our colleagues of color and our junior faculty in particular to carry unfair burdens? And to put it bluntly, at your institution, is DEI work the work of Black people and Black people only, or is it the work of your entire community? Because the answer to that question is a really important one, not just for how that work gets done, but what it says about your larger campus community and culture. So we need to be, thinking equity, and it needs to suffuse everything we do. And equity is not the same thing as equality, right? They're related, but they're not the same thing. And we need to think hard about what the ramifications of that insight are for our practice. For our junior faculty, if we want to encourage folks to be taking pedagogical risks, if we want to seed innovative teaching methods, those are risk-taking measures that someone who is not yet tenured is going to be hesitant to do, because of we know sometimes that student evaluations for certain types of pedagogies, there's some resistance there at first, right? And so what are the professional consequences I suffer if I change my class to team-based learning, for example? So one of the specific things you can do, and my institution has done this actually, the promotion and tenure committee at my institution has said, look, if you are in the tenure pipeline or the renewal, continuing contract pipeline, and you want to try something new in one of your classes, but you're worried that A, it might not work completely, or B, that there might be some pushback, just designate that section of your course in your portfolio, and we will not use student evaluations in that course in any summative way in your evaluation. They will be there for your formative evaluation only. And so what that does is it gives junior faculty the freedom to say, I can try this thing, and even if there's pushback or even if it doesn't quite work, I can still take things out of it. And I'm not going to suffer a hit in my tenure portfolio, for example, if things don't turn out the way that I might hope. So what we've done is carved institutional space that has told faculty, we're not only saying we want you to experiment, to try these things, we are supporting you in experimenting and trying these things. And as the administrators love to hear this phrase, it is revenue neutral, right? It doesn't cost anybody anything, but the payoff for that is tremendous. So that's modeling your institutional mission in the way that you're creating space for your faculty. And I would argue that this, applies as well to our adjunct and part-time colleagues in terms of their evaluation and rehiring. Do you have mechanisms that allow for that? Are you putting your principles into practice?
I really appreciate you kind of emphasizing the need for the community as a whole to kind of be doing that diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Because you're right, on one hand, often it falls to the community members of color, or it remains kind of funneled through the powers that be, and neither one of those are kind of ideal ways of really approaching and instituting in diversity and inclusion, right? In ways that actually matter for faculty and students. And so it's 8:14 now, but we do have one last question in the queue, and I did want to ask that in part because it's connected to, right, we're talking about ungrading, we're talking about taking risks, and we're also talking about being attuned to our students and their kind of emotions and affective kind of reactions to certain things. And this question is asking about, well, when does kind of that change take a toll? How do you address that change in ways that continue to make students feel comfortable, even as what you think you're doing in the classroom is helping them? Perhaps they're resistant in some ways because it's so far out of the norm for them.
Yeah, that's one of the key things that we need to keep in mind is a lot of times some of the things that we want to try in our class are so far outside the regular routine experience of what our students have come to expect from academics that it can be unsettling, right? We all, there is something, and we've done this too, right? Like we've gone to presentations before where it's like, I just want to sit here and listen to you. Don't make me do group work, right? Like, don't make me do anything. I just want to be. And so sometimes, our students are like that too, right? And I think the answer to that is, have we created a culture of just transparency in terms of the course, right? And so a radical transparency for our students, like these are, here's my thought process behind trying this thing. And how are we going to communicate whether this thing is working? And there's a whole bunch of really good stuff out there about this idea of transparency. The Tilt Higher Ed project, the Transparency in Learning and Teaching, uses an ethic of transparency to really talk about the ways that we present assignments and assessments to students that take away a lot of the equity gaps that we've seen in that type of stuff. tilthighered.com has great resources. But I think scaling out this idea of transparency and sharing with our students, like letting them look under the hood. This course is different in these ways than ones that you've encountered. Here's why. Here's my thinking as to why this is a good idea. But I want us to be collaborative in the ways that, if this isn't working, then we do something else, right? We're not chained to it. So what are some ways that we can help each other keep these lines of communication open to make sure? Because the overall goal is the same for both us and our students, right? We want them to be successful. They want them to be successful. So modeling that transparency. And it could even be like just, sort of specific things like in my syllabus, for example, when I have assignments that I'm asking students to do, what is the purpose of those assignments? Can I put in one sentence at the end of the assignment description, this assignment is here because? Like, how am I connecting it to what the outcomes of the class are? Like, can I do that in one sentence? And if so, I should be putting that in my syllabus so students can help make that connection. And I'm not just, rendering it implicit. So approaching transparency, I think, is a priority. Helps us, be honest. I mean, be honest with students in general, but in particular, when we're trying things in class that are outside their realm of experience, preparing them for that involves just sort of getting that out there and foregrounding it, right? This will be different. Different doesn't mean bad. Different might be harder, but here's the payoff if we're all able to do this together. And I think having that conversation early also sets a great tone for when things get a little more cognitively intense throughout the semester too.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think just in that answer alone, you've given us several, incremental but actionable things to do in the classroom that can put us toward that sense of radical hope that we so desperately need. And although we can't do a great unmuting here today, I do want to just give you a hand clap and say thank you so much, Dr. Gannon. It's really been a pleasure. And I believe you've left us with a lot to think about and consider and perhaps hopefully demand in the future.
Well, thank you so much
everyone.
for having me here. Thanks everyone for being here.